This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Robert, Kathryn, and I are talking about misunderstood rules of Storycraft. So those rules that have become popularized, people like to spout them, but don't necessarily know what they mean. So the rule can actually become a limiting factor in your writing, or rules that people adhere to when they really ought to be breaking them. So that's another way a rule could become a limiting factor, and so on. So the one that comes to my mind first is show, don't tell. That's an oldie, but a goodie.
Yeah, that one gets spouted a lot.
Yes, and it's actually a valuable rule, and it makes perfect sense when you understand it. But what I have found is that a lot of writers think show, don't tell means that you can't have narrative in your story because that's telling, and telling is bad. Right? And that's not the case. That's not what telling is. Telling is a specific type of writing where the narrative becomes bland, it veers into info dumps, it lacks voice, it explains things to the reader that are better off seen in scene through action and dialogue. So it's a kind of narrative that is just weak and causes drag in your pacing, loses your voice, loses your reader because it's not engaging. Head nodding here.
We listen to you telling us how it is.
Okay, well.
Right. I have a good example of a book that you would think tells a lot, but is actually showing a lot. I just finished reading a book called The Art of Racing in the Rain by Garth Stein. Have either of you guys read that?
No.
Okay, so it's from the perspective of the protagonist's dog. And so there's a lot of limiting factors in terms of what he can tell in the story because he's not present, or but he will explain it in narrative exposition, what has happened, or he'll, talk about how he's filling in the gaps. But as he's filling in the gaps, he's using like things he's seen on TV or, other things like that. So you get this really fascinating and compelling story that is very visual and very vivid. But it's not a lot of, because you're using the dog as the narrator, there's a ton of just paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs of narrative exposition because that's the vehicle that the dog has to explain it to you. But it's so rich and vivid in terms of how the author uses that exposition. So it's still shown. You get to see everything, even when you aren't present, because the dog wasn't allowed to go into the courtroom, for instance, or whatever.
Right.
But that it's not being told to you. It's not like the dog's telling you what happened. He's explaining it in a manner that's very good, I guess.
Right.
There.
It's
End
storytelling.
Of sentence.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And good storytelling is always showing whether you're receiving narrative exposition or a fist fight or, a conversation. Those are sort of your tools on the page in the finished product, what the reader receives. You're going to have narrative, you're going to have dialogue, and you're going to have action. And you need all three. You can't avoid narrative.
Right.
So when writers try to limit their narrative in honor of the show, don't tell rule, they end up choking off their narrator and really limiting the capacity their story has for richness and evocative imagery, for voice, for mood, for, descriptions of setting. All of those things suffer when writers are afraid of telling.
And I think character depth as well, because I think when you're so deep into the character's head like that, sometimes it's that's the other thing that I think happens sometimes when you misunderstand show versus tell is you end up so surface level because you're just trying to show.
Right.
and when you're like six layers deep into the character's psyche, then all of a sudden it just makes so much more sense and it's so much more vivid. And so, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And you get a lot of people saying he thought this. No, don't do that.
Yeah, the whole thinking, feeling, wondering is a big trap, isn't it? And I definitely fell into that with my first book, and I got a professional report back on it from something, and it was a very pleasing report. It's a 4 out of 5 stars, and Scanlan would do better to concentrate more on showing, not telling. And I thought, but I've been through that 13 times now, that draft, and I've definitely focused on showing. And then it was only later when I went back to it, when I was writing books 2 and 3, that I realized how much she felt annoyed that I'd used that type of thing. And yes, you're quite right. There are times when you might use that because it's just a throwaway and just a transition into another act of the scene. But to use it as your only vehicle for demonstrating emotion is poor. Poor craft.
Right.
So it's really, I think, as you say, it's quite tough to understand. I didn't really understand it, I don't think, properly until somebody said, it's a bit like an actor walking out onto the stage and looking at somebody and saying, "I'm feeling angry."
Right.
We would just know. You go to a play that's like that, you think it's terrible. You'd expect the actor to act it out. But equally, there are times where you don't want to show don't tell when it's a really long bus journey that's taking your character from one place to another that takes 3 hours, and it's irrelevant. You can just say, I caught the bus and sat next to a grumpy old woman. It really annoyed me. But anyway, I got there in the end.
No, I think it should take 3 hours to read that passage so that we really experience it.
Well, but this is the point I was going to make is that it depends. What is your narrative drive in that scene? And it's about what you're bringing. To me, show don't tell is about what you're bringing to the fore,
right?
And that you really need to feel that the reader has to live.
Well, and this is why if you read a play versus see a play, even if you read the play out loud, it's going to take you significantly shorter amount of time to just read it than if you were visually seeing it performed.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Well, and what writers tend to forget is that the narrator provides the reader with the lens on the story, the visual lens on the story, as well as the emotional lens on the story. So, it's like you mentioned plays. If we think of the movie screen, the narrator is the camera through which we show the reader everything besides the actors, and we let the reader hear everything besides dialogue. And that includes, so much of the world. Like if you could put a movie in Photoshop or something and strip away everything except the human beings, how enjoyable would that movie be?
Right.
I remember when I was training to do some counselling work, and one of the things that you try to do is help people understand when they're because often they'll tell you and explain a situation, and sometimes it helps them. You say, I can't do that. Well, what does it look like to can't do that? Show me how you'd not do that now. And then all of a sudden you'd see the expression and the body would tighten up, or they'd speak in a different way, or their eyes would move somewhere, or they'd start, pulling their hair. And those are the clues to us, I think, as writers, that there's more to bringing something to life than just describing it.
Right.
And so I think a useful thing with the show don't tell is to, how does a character do that, so that I could then replicate that as the reader, as opposed to just try and understand how I might do that if it's just named as a concept.
Right.
So anyway, but we're not. You were talking about it's a guideline, it's a rule that people maybe get too sticky about, and I guess we're finding ourselves voting for it still.
Well,
also,
you must show
yes.
and not tell, but you need to understand what it means to be telling, because telling is not the same as using narrative exposition in your story. I mean, just the example of showing a character's emotion through their facial expression and body language. The narrator must be the camera lens pointed at the character, because if you're only in that character's point of view, looking out at the world through the character's eyes, you might say, I scrunched my face and pulled my shoulders up to my ears and my gut clenched, but probably not. You're more likely to say, I got so mad, I shouted or something. It's so we need the narrative lens to give us the perspective on the character from without the character, because it gives the reader so much more perspective.
I do find first person quite tricky for this. The balance between, as you say, that you need some elements of, I notice the tension in my shoulders mounting, and I do my best to let it go. But you can't always use that. It's not because of, as you say, a person wouldn't be wandering around, feeling all these things and thinking about them at the same time. So I do find that a little tricky, the balance between, if someone's saying something to my character and it's irking them, how do I portray that by showing when I'm in their head already? Do I portray that by showing, his words hit me like a bullet in the stomach, or do I say, I notice my entire body tensing up as he goes on, or do I say nothing and just say what he said really peed me off?
Well, I think the metaphor was the best. The bullet in the stomach gives us the sense of tension and anxiety and maybe even anger and shock. But there you're using your character's perspective and voice. So a bullet in the stomach is stylistically that narrator's voice. And what writers forget is that in first-person narrative, your character is two people, the doer and the narrator.
And the narrator,
right. So you still need to have a narrative lens through which the reader can experience the story. It just happens to be the protagonist's lens and the protagonist telling the story. So, and I'm going to just mention my book, The Storyworks Guide to Writing Point of View, because it's all about exactly what we're talking about here.
Okay, so show, don't tell, a widely misunderstood rule.
Right. What else? What are some other rules we should talk about?
Well.
I'm waiting because I brought one to the table, so I'm going to open it up to you two.
Adverbs are absolutely the worst thing to use. Absolutely.
How come? What's wrong with those poor little ly words?
Because we were told so.
Yeah, that's right.
Who said?
Because there's usually something stronger in place.
People. You heard it on the internet, right?
I heard it from people. Yes.
So how do you feel about that one? What's wrong with adverbs? Anything? Is it a stupid rule? Is it a rule? Is it just a meme that went around?
I think it's a great guideline, actually. I think it's very easy to slip into weak writing, particularly, when we just talked about show, don't tell. Adverbs can be, in place of a stronger verb, definitely a way to fall into telling. He said angrily. That's weak compared to, he said fist on the table. I think in some aspects, the way I've learned to think about it, because I used to get frustrated that I couldn't avoid them, and personally, I can't avoid them. They creep in, and I've tried eradicating them completely, and then realised that everybody who says eradicate them completely doesn't appear to do it either. So I figure, Stephen King, I'm talking to you, and we're like this, so I let them be there in first draft everywhere, and I use revisions to strengthen sentences, basically. That's the way I do it. Because I think that, and in dialogue, I don't care. Characters use adverbs, so I never ever strip them out from dialogue unless never ever, unless I think that the character should have said something differently, of course.
Right.
I allow them in the sort of supporting narrative to come out in first draft, and then when I revise, just look for strengthening, and inevitably, I can make it better. So, but I just said inevitably, which is an adverb. So they're in use everywhere.
They are, and this raises such a great point, Robert, what you were saying about it's hard not to use them. So let yourself use them, but then do your work revising, go through, look for better words, because this applies not just to adverbs, but to every word choice you make. There's this moment in Dead Poets Society when Robin Williams, the English teacher at the boys' prep school, says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, don't say you're depressed, say you're, and they come up with the word morose, right? So don't say you're very depressed or very sad or very happy or whatever. Very happy, what is that? Maybe it's jubilant, know. So
euphoric.
Yeah, euphoric. Find a better word. So adverbs, it's that same thing applied to describing verbs. Don't rest on the ly. Go find a better verb to use.
Could you briefly talk about what's the difference between weak and strong? Like we talked about something that's a weak verb versus a strong, making a sentence stronger, like what that means too, because I think people throw that around without really defining it as well.
Oh, you put me on the spot, Kathryn.
I did.
Well, you could say,
well,
he shut the door strongly. He slammed the door. So you've
perfect.
got shut or slam.
There you go. Or he shut the door weakly, or he gently nudged it into place. There's another adverb, gently. I think a weak word is one that is not the best word choice for the intended effect on the reader. So if you are trying to write, say, an emotional scene, the whole goal is to have the reader feel that emotion, to empathize with your characters, for your voice and mood to impact that reader appropriately. And if you're relying on sort of flat language, it was raining, I was sad, I walked the dog and not a single bird sang, and right, like who cares? Do you feel sad? Do you care about the character or the dog or the rain?
But I'm bored. If that's what you wanted me to do, that's fine.
Exactly. You're going to bore your readers. So you need to identify your chosen effect for that moment in the story. Is it excitement, thrilling? Is it, to create a sense of high stakes dramatic tension or weepiness, a real like tearjerker moment or titillation or whatever your goal is. Our tool is words. That's it. Mm-hmm. How are you going to do that? You aren't going to create an effect if your word choices are weak, if they're ineffective, if they don't help you move your reader in some way.
Right. So here's another one that I've heard that goes hand in hand with this is like, don't use verb forms of to be because they're weak.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So was and is, MR, etc. But was is inevitable. You can't write hardly a paragraph without using was,
that's
right?
Conjugation, so that's going to be there.
Right. But people fall into the habit of relying on it and not using strong words, descriptive words, saying she is happy is weak writing. It's telling, not showing, right? Saying her eyes lit up as her eyes lit as her smile reached them. And, she opened her arms to embrace the friend she hadn't seen in 6 years.
Right.
Right.
Well,
I am happy versus the smile that reached her eyes. That's showing versus telling. That's avoiding the word to be, is, was. So what you want to do is, like Robert was saying about the adverbs, is in your first draft, get the story on the page, but make yourself become conscious of was and all its various conjugations, including gerunds, you know.
For example, you were saying it was raining. Then I might write that in the first draft, and then I'll catch that. And actually, some of the automated tools aren't bad for this either. Your Grammarly's and Pro writing aids are quite good at picking up was, is, had, and that kind of thing. And they'll point it out to you and say, this might be an example of passive voice, or it might be an example, could you make this stronger?
Right.
So even if you don't employ an editor, or you're in your early part of preparing your manuscript before it goes to an editor, this is a good way to teach yourself, I think.
Right.
So you could say it was raining, or you could say the water fell out the sky and my newspaper was pulp before I'd even reached the end of the street. And it's a completely different way of stating something, and depending on your intent for how hard the rain was or what the person is doing. So I think sometimes it's not even necessarily saying, instead of saying it was raining, the rain was hard, I still got was. It rained heavily. Okay, I've got an adverb. But is there a completely different way that I can even show that, where, the rain hit my head, and within minutes my hair was stuck to my skull, or whatever. So is there a way that we can portray it?
Yeah, and I want to point out that first you've got the was, it was raining, then you've got the adverb, it rained heavily, and those are both telling, and then you moved into showing. So you went into sensory detail that will bring the reader into that moment, be present, and feel something, feel an experience like rain being hard enough that it wets your scalp before you can get from your car to your home, right?
Yeah.
Right.
That sort of thing. That's the difference between telling and showing. And we're seeing how these rules are sort of coming together to make us better storytellers, to make us better writers.
Some words are really semantically packed. My clothes were wet is different to my clothes were drenched. Drenched is more semantically packed. It has an immediate impression that is more specific than wet.
Right.
Wet could mean damp, or it could mean absolutely a puddle of water somewhere. So I think there's word choice when you go back and revise to strengthen. I love it.
Right.
Having trained in aspects of linguistics, I think that kind of thing's fascinating.
Right. And then I want to take that drenched a step further and make it a visual sensory experience and say, his shirt clung to his back. His shirt, now transparent, so wet it became transparent, clung to his back. The tattoo on his bicep showed clearly through the white cotton or whatever your scene is, but you're bringing that lens, that narrative lens, into the moment, and you're showing the reader not only that the character was wet, but that he's so wet his shirt's transparent. And depending on, maybe this is our charming rogue character, so his muscles are well defined or whatever, and that tattoo might have symbolic significance. It might be one of your tropes, and so you start working all of these elements together as you go from the weak writing, it was raining, to the showing, visual, specific, emotive, stylized writing that grabs the reader and compels her to keep going in your story. Yeah.
And I just also want to mention there's a time, because we talk about where these rules fall down as well. And I know early, I think my daughter was towards the end of primary school. What do you call primary school in the States? Elementary, So she's in her last year, I think. And I went into the classroom, and on the the walls of the classroom with some excellent things about storytelling, and a few things about making your writing more interesting. And it had this whole line of, try to use something else other than said. And
right.
And so you got all these people falling into the trap of using a telling word instead of just said, or even removing dialogue tags altogether if you can. And I think that's something that you don't notice it when you're reading a book that is really brilliant at not using those things, and you sometimes notice it when it's there. And then if you put your editor hat on and try and read a book from a sort of, okay, what is this author doing? I really like this. Why do I like this? And you often find it's because it's what they've left out.
Yeah.
To me, sometimes, so rather than using, he yelled or she screamed or, he sputtered or, they muttered. I mean, nothing wrong. You can obviously have those occasionally. But, when they say, let me think of an example there. That's my checkbook, he growled. Ugh. Well, that's right. So what is it, Scooby-Doo?
No, yeah. The worst is, that's my checkbook, he hissed. No, you can't hiss that. He could hiss, that's my checkbook. That's all the hissing you can do in that sentence. Don't use hissed. It annoys the heck out of me.
Well, there are people who will argue with us, though. I mean, there are people who don't mind that kind of writing, and you do see successful books. J.K. Rowling's one of them. Yeah, there's a lot of what you would call weak sentencing in there, but the characters in the story is so much fun.
Yeah, but you raise a really great point, Robert, that said is a valuable word because it becomes invisible. We just understand what it means, and you shouldn't rely on these descriptive dialogue tags. You should use your character's word choice and emotional state and the tension inherent in the scene, whether it's dramatic or comedic or whatever, to make that understood by the reader. It's subtext. You shouldn't have to, tap your reader on the shoulder and go, "You said that angrily."
Yes.
He yelled that one. He was, use them sparingly so when you do, they're purposeful and they have an effect. Don't rely on them. There's
no other modifier that you can really realistically use.
Yeah, or when it's just a nice shorthand. Because sometimes it's appropriate to say, he shouted, if your character is yelling across the street to someone. You could say, you could use an exclamation point and say, he shouted, because it doesn't really work to say exclamation point, he said. It's like putting a decrescendo at the end of something. That's right. Exactly. That should be loud and, So, but I'm glad you brought that up.
Right. Well, and in that example, too, you're talking about it was physically a loud shout. You're not talking about the emotional state.
Yes.
Right.
Of the character.
Nice distinction. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and you might say, something like, he said in a loud voice, too loud, I thought, for the restaurant. So you could use it. You can use that. It depends on your intent of these whole things. I suppose the thing that we're trying to say is that rule where you avoid the adverbs qualifying every single said tag, or you try and be so artful. That's an interesting jumper, he exclaimed.
Right.
Right.
It's kind of to me it seems juvenile writing.
Yes,
well, and
it
then
becomes
you ran the
tedious.
risk of you ran the risk of feeling like a thesaurus, which is not what you want to do.
No. No. All right, so rules are generally not absolutes. Understand them, use them wisely, because they are practical and handy and often full of great advice, but none of them should be taken to the extreme, and they should all be used with full comprehension of what they actually mean.
Yeah. Well, and we'd love to hear more. So bring them into the Facebook group so we can all, all hear.
Yeah.
Because I think at the end of the day, it's a skill set that you're developing, and in any profession where we're taught a set of skills, we never learn the advanced ones first. You learn the basics, and I think it's important to learn the basics by even sometimes adhering to these so-called rules so you can understand how it all works. And then when you understand the craft, you know where to, inverted commas, break a rule,
right,
or stray from it, because they're there for good reason. We have, typically in the Western world, we have the 3 or 4 act structure, we have conflicts, we have an antagonist and a protagonist. And they're there for a reason, because that's how stories work for us.
Right.
So if you break that, then do that at your own peril. And I think that even comes down to the micro level of, as you say, adjectives, adverbs, how we show, how we tell. And so it's easy, I think, for a lot of new authors to go, but I want to write something that's groundbreaking. Yeah, well, learn the craft first.
So true. All right, that is it for this week. Head over to Facebook, join the Storyworks Writers Facebook group, and let us know what rules you love to break, love to abide by, which rules you think are stupid. It's all good. Bring it on.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.